Hello and welcome to tonight's OCR A Level PE Sociocultural webinar. So if I just get you onto your first slide, we'll just do a quick sound check and make sure everything's working. Resources for the webinar, pre-webinar, you should have received your Sociocultural webinar notes that you can use throughout the session to kind of to make notes on, add additional things, and if you've got any questions, obviously you can send those through to me on the question tab. Okay, post-webinar, you'll receive an emergence and evolution, a modern sport and a contemporary issues revision pack, so part 1 and part 2 of the sociocultural specification that you can fill out. So throughout the kind of webinar tonight, what I've kind of done is there will be some slides on there that I'm not going to go through, but I put them in there so that it will help you fill out the kind of the revision packs when you get them. So sometimes I will skate over slides, but I'll let you know when I'm doing that. Okay, so let's have a look there. So firstly, objectives, what we're going to look at, the key focus of tonight's webinar. So we're looking at the following then. Firstly, I mean, as always, it's really important that we learn from what was the first exam series, the first full exam series, 2018, and have a look at improving our exam techniques. We're going to have a look at some specific little tasks for you to have a go at on that. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to have a look at some specific social and cultural factors that could really enhance our understanding of how to apply knowledge to exam questions based upon the emergence and evolution through the different time periods. After that, we're going to have a look at kind of some areas within 21st century Britain and have a look at how we can memorize those using some unique memory methods. Finally, we're going to have a look at targeting kind of unexamined areas from the 2018 exam and really have a look at how these might form the basis of a 10-mark synoptic question. Okay, so if I just get you an overview then, this is our kind of where we're going to be looking at. Part 1 of the webinar is going to be looking at this kind of section here. We won't be covering all of that, but certainly quite a bit of that we'll have a look at. So then part 2 we'll have a quick look at drugs, violence and technology in our final part of the webinar. So if we start off then, it's really important that we kind of start this focus by having a look at the social and cultural factors that transcend the different time periods in the specification. So we have to know about pre-industrial, post-1850 Britain, alongside the public schools, 20th century Britain, 21st century. So we have to have an understanding of the 7 social and cultural factors that kind of, like I said, transcend through these time periods. So in order to do that, you might say we have to move through the times. We have to kind of run through the times. You might say we have to leg it through the times. The reason why I'm talking like this is because in order to kind of remember these social and cultural factors, as always, I'll try and give you some way to remember it. So if you imagine you've got to move through the ages, got to run through the ages, got to leg it through the ages, let's use the acronym CLEGIT through the ages. Okay, so CLEGIT, leg it, CLEGIT, we get it into here. This will transcend into class, law and order, education and literacy, gender, income, time, transport. And then when it gets to post-1850 Britain, we have this idea that class will actually also dictate whether people took part in sports as amateur or professional. Okay, so that is the kind of thing that we'll look at on top of there. Obviously, you've got those sections here. So just to make sure we've got them in, it's massively important we know each of these social and cultural factors because they are going to be massively influential in our ability to answer questions across all the different time periods. So I'm sure you've got stuff that maybe you use already for that, but I just wanted to make sure that was in your head and ready to go. So let's have a look then. What did we learn from 2018 kind of exam series for sociocultural issues? Now, I did quite a lot of marking on this paper, and the key focus really within it. There was actually a fair bit of assessment objective 1 that caused problems with regard to knowledge and understanding. And secondly, there's a fair bit to do with kind of, again, this kind of assessment objective 3. So let's have a look then. Now, one particular question caused all kinds of problems, a multitude of problems, and it was this one. Okay, so if you have a look on here, 2018, compare the characteristics of pre-industrial pastimes for sport play in the 19th century public schools. Now, I'm not even bothered about the kind of the assessment objective 3 stuff here. All I'm bothered about or really concerned with, or as a cohort we should be concerned with, was this idea here. Now, people really struggled, not obviously with the compare part of it, but before that they struggle with this idea of the characteristics of pre-industrial sports and pastimes. And the reason why was because the specification, as we just looked at then, has a real focus on kind of the social and cultural factors. But what students tended not to do is have an understanding of how social and cultural factors actually influence characteristics of pre-industrial, post-industrial, whatever the time period sport. So it's absolutely vital. It's that even though the specification lists these social and cultural factors, you must know the characteristics which they shape. And I'm going to give you a little task just to make sure that we understand that the social and cultural factors influence characteristics. The second kind of exam feedback, I think, is from the same question. Okay, so the same question, but now it was the command word again. So it's that recurrent theme of being able to compare characteristics. It's probably the hardest exam skill, or certainly came across as being the hardest exam skill from 2018. It's really important we're ready to go with this idea of comparing characteristics. So, I mean, I've talked about this a couple of times now. So when we're comparing characteristics, if it's 5 marks, you have to have 10 points, and it's best to do it as a kind of a two-pronged sentence, really, with a connective that contrasts in the middle. So let's have a look then. I'll give you a specific kind of view of this in action. So this was a student's response with regard to comparing the characteristics of pre-industrial sports alongside comparing 19th century public school characteristics. As you can see, didn't start badly at all here. So pre-industrial sports are usually cruel, so they recognise that the social and cultural factor law and order influences characteristic. A lack of it meant that activities were usually cruel, for example cockfighting, but then struggle to compare it to public school characteristics. Down here, managed to get one here, so they've done one here, and you can see straight away the first one is done in this kind of highlighted, and then if they get the direct comparison, as you can see here, both sides of the comparison need to get a mark. So you look, there's a paragraph of work that is basically counted to 1 mark. So I think it's absolutely vital, as you can see here, the mark schemes here. You can see these are the characteristics, because it says here mostly, not always. It's looking more of a lower class point of view. These are the characteristics, and then it's got characteristics of these. So you've got to compare them. Now, to me, it's absolutely pointless within this webinar now of us focusing on same question, because that ship has set sail. However, what we are aware of is the fact that there are going to be questions that you have to compare. So if they're going to do this, before we go on to the compare section, let's have a look at the first mistake. Common mistake, was this idea of using social and cultural factors to shape the characteristics of sport. So if we use mob football here, I'll just get you to do a quick task. If this is a social and cultural factor, what I want you to do is then apply it to how the characteristics of mob football was shaped due to these factors. So in this case, if I start you off, social and cultural factor 1, class, okay, so there's a 2-class society, and specifically mob football was a lower class activity. So see if you can do that. Lack of law and order, therefore mob football was, and see if you can have a go at that. So I'll let you go through. That should take about 30 seconds just to have a go at filling those in. Okay, so if we have a quick check of the answers then, so as we've seen there, so a lack of law and order meant that mob football, for example, was violent. Also, a lack of education and literacy meant that majority of lower class activities had simple unwritten rules. Gender, as you can see in the picture here, mob football was male dominated. A lack of income meant that the kind of activities that were played were simple and natural. For example, mob football was simple and natural. Pig's bladder as an example of a kind of simple natural element of the game. And then from there you've got time. A lack of time meant that mob football was occasional, for example Shrovetide football here. And then a lack of transport meant that the kind of mob football was played locally. So you can see here, that's the factor, and this is the characteristic that it shapes, and it's really important we do that. And of course, if it didn't give you an example, you could then put this as mob football as an example down here if you're applying it to the lower class. Now, second exam focus, as we looked at before, was this idea of being able to compare pre-industrial characteristics with, in the question you looked at was public schools. But what I'd like you to have a go at now, just because that ship has set sail, let's have a look at this section here. So compare pre-industrial characteristics with post-1850 industrial Britain characteristics. So as you can see here, I've given these are social and cultural factors which shape the characteristics of pre-industrial Britain. From your knowledge, I'm assuming you will have this kind of knowledge already. Could you then compare it to the post-1850 industrial Britain, which is, in essence, very similar to 19th century public schools because the time period was the same. So see if you can work that out. I'll give you 30 seconds again to have a go at that quick task. Okay, so we've got here 2 class. However, post-1850 industrial Britain was a 3-class society, cruel and violent, pre-industrial. However, more civilized and respectable in post-1850 industrial Britain. Education and literacy, there's a lack of it, so simple unwritten rules in pre-industrial Britain. However, in post-1850 industrial Britain, it was the written codified rules due to the creation of these kind of national governing bodies, for example, the FA. Pre-industrial, so male-dominated here. However, and you can see how that works. It's a really important exam skill that, you know, to make sure we don't run out of steam, that we do these direct comparisons within a sentence. We have something in the middle to show that we're comparing, and then we've got the 2 characteristic sets here. So hopefully you can see on that is exactly how you need to kind of compare characteristics to make sure you don't fall into the trap that you know, so many students fell into last year. Average mark on that question was 1.5 nationally out of 5. You know, so many marks dropped due to poor exam technique, and I guess to an extent the fact that you know, some people struggle with the actual, you know, the exam question in the first place, how social and cultural factors influence the characteristics of kind of pre-industrial Britain. So that's that. That's our kind of exam technique focus complete. So if we have a look, then we'll start off the kind of content webinar by having a quick look at pre-industrial Britain. So these are social and cultural factors. I've kind of redone those, so you've got it via Cleggett. The key thing I wanted to look at really with pre-industrial Britain, firstly, was this kind of the importance of social class in pre-industrial Britain. And let's be honest, pre-industrial Britain forms the framework by which we answer all of the other time periods. For example, post-1850 Britain, 20th century Britain, and 21st century Britain. So it's really important we have an understanding of that to start with. So what do I mean? Why is class so important? So if we have a look at this here, pre-industrial Britain, we've got to ask ourselves a question. Class is obviously a key social and cultural factor. We have to ask ourselves how many. Now, once we use this and understand this, class is so important because it's a hierarchical kind of construct here. The acronym, how many classes there are going to dictate how we can apply our knowledge of all the other social and cultural factors to different exam questions. So for example, by knowing there is 2 classes, that allows us to answer a question just solely on class. So for example, you know, explain the impact or the influence of class on pre-industrial pastimes or participation in pre-industrial pastimes. So straight away, by knowing there's 2 classes, an upper class and a lower class, that allows us to talk firstly about activities. So for example, an upper class person, someone in the upper classes, in the gentry, for example, they could play activities such as real tennis, or they would play activities such as real tennis, whereas people in the lower class would play activities such as mob football. On top of that, class will also dictate the roles, because sometimes there are certain activities that act almost as an anomaly, and the 2 classes played together, but they have very different roles. That's, for example, cricket, where you would have the batsman will be kind of upper class, and the bowlers would be almost like the dog in a field and chase after the ball. Now, that is a question in itself, the impact of class on sports or activities in pre-industrial Britain. But even more important than that is the fact that class, having an understanding of 2 classes, allows us to apply our knowledge on the following social and cultural factors 2 ways. So what I mean by that is, if you look in here, so if you are someone from the lower class, this means that you would have low levels of education and literacy. Therefore, this would mean that you play unwritten kind of simple rules such as mob football, whereas if you were in the upper class, you would have high levels of education and literacy. Therefore, you would be taking part in activities such as real tennis with complex rules. Same with income. Lower class, low income, simple activities such as mob football, bare knuckle fighting, whereas upper class would have a high level of income, which meant they would be doing activities such as real tennis, where they could buy expensive rackets, etc. Now, you have to apply both classes to these. So can I ask you now to start to say, okay, so how does social class link to time? How does social class link to transport? In fact, what I'm going to ask you to do is, for this idea of time, once we've split time and kind of applied it to lower class and upper class, can I ask you to have a quick go at this question? So have a look at it, see how you go, applying class.